In mission, you have to know when to throw out the playbook. Hey, I'm Pastor Matt here with your Missionary Pathway Mission Insight. And this insight is really important because oftentimes the best practices of the past are not going to be the things that reach people today. Now, I was reminded of this concept when I was talking to an old school church planter. You know, one of the reasons I love talking to church planters is because I was a church planter, and I've learned that whenever somebody planted a church, it doesn't matter if it was 3 or 4 generations ago or it was 3 or 4 weeks ago, there are incredible lessons that can be learned. And one of the things I've learned from the old school church planters, the guys that used to go out with a pencil and a note card and just knock on doors, is just how much effort you put into planting. Well, this was one of those guys, a guy who took a note card and a pencil and went out and just canvassed a neighborhood, knocking on doors. His goal was to knock on 60 plus doors a day and make contact with people. Now, when he was doing this, there was a best practice, and his mission exec told him, when you go out there, you have to dress nice. You have to wear a nice suit, tie, good shoes. So he did that. He put on a nice suit, tie, shoes, and he went out and he knocked on doors. But he wasn't really getting a great response. In fact, in some cases, he would knock on a door, somebody would open it up, they'd do a little casual, polite conversation, close the door, and then he would look down the block as all the doors and windows would close down the street. And all of a sudden, people were magically not home. And as he looked at this, he was baffled. I mean, come on, this was the best practice, right? But as he looked, he saw other people that were knocking on doors were getting a much better response. Problem was, they weren't dressed up in a nice suit and tie. They were dressed in shorts, a polo, usually wore a lanyard and had a silver clipboard. They worked for yard services and other service companies. And so he sat there and said, this might be an opportunity to throw out the playbook. Now, he didn't put it in those terms, but what he did was he went out and he bought a polo and shorts and a lanyard and a silver clipboard. And he started going out and he started knocking on doors. And all of a sudden, people would open the doors. People would have a conversation with him, and the church grew. In that instance, the church grew by 65 people in less than 4 months. What happened? Well, he knew it was time to throw out the playbook. And I think in mission, you have to know there are moments where you need to throw out the playbook because, like I said earlier, the best practices of the past aren't always the things that are going to reach the present. So, how do you know when to throw out the playbook? Well, number one, be curious about the culture. You need to be curious about your culture and your context. Because when you're curious about the context, the more you get to know it, the more you will learn the language of the culture, and you'll learn what you need to do to be able to translate the gospel into the language of the people. You'll learn the things you need to do to really be able to connect with people. And because that planter was curious about the culture, he noticed things in the culture that allowed him to better connect with the people he was trying to connect with in the culture. So be curious about your culture. Number two, know what you can't change. I think it's really important to remember that this is historic Christianity and the gospel that Jesus has given us to share with other people. And that means there are things about that that God has handed down that He does not allow us to change, because by changing them, we lose the effectiveness of the gospel and we lose the point that Jesus was trying to bring, which was to reconnect us to the Father. And so there are certain things when you're doing mission that should never change for the sake of mission. Now, what are those things? Well, just go back to the things that have always historically been a part of the church, from the book of Acts all the way through to today. Doesn't matter the culture, the language, it's always there. Jesus, the scriptures, the historic creeds that have always been a navigating point for us in the church, word and sacrament, things like communion and baptism and confession and absolution. It doesn't matter the culture, those have always been a part of the church. Those are what I like to call the non-negotiables of Christianity. You can't change the non-negotiables, but the non-negotiables are also the things that make Christianity so powerful and transformational in people's lives. So, know the things you can't change. But number three, know the things you can change. There are things within the church that have always been changing and always will be changing. And you need to know what those things are so that you know where you have freedom when you step into a culture to change things. Like in the story I told you, he realized a suit and tie or a polo and shorts is not going to change the gospel. So which thing is going to make it easier for him to connect? You can change all kinds of things. You can change worship style, music style, the language you use to speak the gospel. You can change the location that churches gather. You can change the number of people that gather together. None of those things are going to make a difference in the gospel, but they could make it easier for you to connect. So know what you can change. And then finally, be able to articulate why you're doing what you're doing. You need to be able to articulate why you're doing what you're doing because sometimes people are going to have questions. And those questions aren't always attacks. They just come from people who honestly want to make sure that they're doing the right thing that's helping them connect with Jesus. And different things cause people to have questions. So be able to articulate why you're doing what you're doing. That church planner could easily have walked into the mission director's office, and when he goes, "Why'd you throw the playbook out? Why aren't you wearing the suit and tie?" He would be able to say, "Look at this opportunity to connect with people now that I've changed what I'm wearing. So if I'm able to connect with more people by changing what I'm wearing, do you think it's an okay thing?" He would have been able to articulate why he was doing what he's doing. And you should always be able to articulate why you're doing what you're doing when you're throwing the playbook out. Well, I hope this mission insight was helpful for you. If it was, take this opportunity, click like and subscribe and share it out with somebody else that could use this insight and is trying to connect with people missionally. And then of course, if you'd like to learn how you can go on mission in the places you live, work, learn, and play, check out the Missionary Pathway. The Missionary Pathway is an incredible resource that can help you learn how to share the gospel in the everyday spaces you're already going. So if you need help wanting to learn how to share your faith, wanting to learn how to make a disciple, or just learn how you and your ministry can be more missional, check out missionarypathway.org. And until next time, it's always a joy hanging out with you right here on Mission Insights.